Hey everyone, it's Grace Artist, and I am back with you for another episode of Harlots and Hearses. Today's episode, we are going back to another topic that is near and dear to my heart. This episode ties back to one of my fun history facts that I always love to tell people. So every time, I tell people like, oh, I majored in history, I got my master's in history, they always hit me with the, oh, like, what's your favorite fun fact that you love to give? And to that, I always respond of, well, believe it or not, in the 1700s, the mid to late 1700s, if you were in London at the time, you could actually purchase a book that would rate and review all of the known prostitutes of the period. And then everyone, after I tell them that fact, they look at me with a look of shock and also just live like, how the fuck do you know that? And that's when I kind of like go into like, well, I got my master's in, gender and sexuality. And, that's always a fun conversation to have. The reality of how I know that is because one day back in, 2020, I was watching a show on Hulu called Harlots, which if you have not seen Harlots, I absolutely recommend. It is a phenomenal show. I wish there were more and more seasons of it, but the show Harlots was actually inspired by the book by one of my favorite historians, Hallie Rubenhold. And the book that it was inspired by was the Covent Garden ladies. I would actually like show it to you. We're going to show it, but I have to like censor it because on the cover it's a lady flashing her nipples, but it's in a phenomenal book. And that show in that book is actually kind of like what got me into this period, this time, this area of study. So I also just like want to send a message for like anyone listening. If there is like a show or period that you are interested in, it can absolutely like, you can use that kind of as like the jumping off point to inspire you, because Hallie Rubenhold definitely did, and this book definitely did for me. So without further ado, we are going to talk about the Harris's List of Covent Garden Ladies, which is that book that rated and reviewed all of the prostitutes. It had a 38-year print run, and it sold about 8,000 copies annually in those 38 each year that it was published. Now, to really get into like the history behind it, we have to understand the area in which it was located, because that plays a huge pivotal role. And then we also have to know the two men who were behind its creation itself. So with that, grab your coffee, grab your favorite drink, and we're going to dive into it. The two main people that we have to like really center this story around are Sam Derrick. He is this like mastermind Irish poet, and he is the one who actually wrote the first editions of Harris's List, and that's just what I'm going to refer to this book as from now on. And then we have the namesake of the list itself, Jack Harris, and he was the pimp master, as he earned that title and nickname throughout the years. Those are our two main subjects. Now, all of this will take place in Covent Garden and the Piazza Theatre District and surrounding areas in London, starting around the 1750s, and like I said, spanning till the 1790s. Now, the location itself will set a huge scene. And the reason behind that is like kind of this area during the day was known for commerce, stores selling huge markets. But at night, the markets shifted to sell like stuff a little bit more of the flesh variety. And then we have the taverns, the coffee houses, and the bar kind of scene. And Hallie Rubenhold, like in her book, she has this really great quote, and I'm gonna do it verbatim because I think it kind of like really just sets the scene of like what is going on and the people kind of involved in this background. She goes, "The pursuit of pleasure is society's greatest leveler. It brings together the sons of dukes to drink with the daughters of tailors and penniless poets, wealthy city merchants and military officers, lawyers, painters, and common criminals interact freely with one another. So these are all the people that are coming to Covent Garden, that are coming to this Piazza Theater District. And specifically the two locations that we're going to be focusing on are Shakespeare's Head and Bedford Coffee House. These are the two places Sam and Jack frequent the most, and this is actually where our story will begin and will set the scene. Now, what's really important, and I'll touch on this a little bit later on in the episode, is that when it comes to women and the women seen here and at these places, it's not women of high society. Respectable women are not seen at these locations. And that was just a known fact. Polite society do not come to these taverns to drink. They do not come to these coffee houses. No. Women of polite society, if they are to drink, they drink at the house. So any woman who is seen at these places, who isn't seen at these establishments, they kind of already have a reputation that follows them. And they go by many names. Rubenhold lists them: women of the town, strumpets, light girls, jades, hussy, Jezebels, wantons, malls, and harlots. And those are the women that would soon fill the books that would become Harris's list of Covent Garden ladies that would sell throughout London. Before we get to the women themselves, first we need to know about the men who would write the book. So when it comes to Jack Harris, there are two stories that follow him. There's the one he told everyone at the height of his success, and then there's the truth. So his alias was that, his father was the youngest son and he had no inheritance, so he set his mark for London, where he met Jack's mother. His father tried his hand at becoming a political writer. He had some success, but ultimately he attached himself to the wrong politician and he found himself arrested and imprisoned. It was during this imprisonment that Jack said his father installed a life lesson that would ultimately stick with him for the rest of his life. His dad told him, "When you get money, my son, studies men's passions and ply them." So this is kind of like his take on a Machiavellian approach. It's essentially learn the man and then learn how to use the man's weaknesses and passions against the man. Make the man work for you. And after his father would die and leave Jack penniless, this would drive Jack into a career and life of criminality, and would make Jack then go to become a pimp. However, one of Jack's associates in the 1770s was kind of getting tired of all of Jack's praises and hearing all about the mystery of Jack and how Jack is this, Jack is that, Jack's father was a criminal himself and installed all these life lessons. And so one of his old work friends, if you will, essentially came out with the truth, and he was like, yeah, none of that is actually true. And in fact, Jack's not even his real name. In fact, Jack's real name was John Harrison, and he actually grew up being raised in a tavern that his family owned. And this is where I kind of want to dive in on a little bit of tavern scenes and coffee house scenes at the time, because I feel that's really pivotal to understand what we're kind of getting into here. So the taverns at the time are not, when we think of taverns, I think it's really important to get rooted in what they really were. So the taverns and the bars that we have now, they're not very much the same thing. So the taverns and the coffee houses, they're very much male-dominated spaces. So that's where men would go. The taverns, obviously, that is where alcohol would be served. Coffee houses, that is where coffee would be served. That is where social gatherings for men would be had. That is where, if they were having any sort of social parties, any sort of meeting, anything like that, that would happen at a tavern. So there was really no women there. Food would be served there. They were essentially these meeting places. And it was known that women, any respectable women, like I said, would not be seen at these places, mainly because it was the ideology that men, once they had liquor in their system, could not really be trusted. So then, if these men could not be trusted, why would we put respectable women around these men? Thus, the women who place themselves there are there for promiscuous reasons. And then that is kind of why the idea of like the prostitute and the tavern and the sex worker, they all kind of go hand in hand, because essentially like that is where they could be found. They're all kind of like intertwined in this very big web. And so that is also like where we see the rise of what is called like a pimp waiter. So at these taverns, you have kind of in the same sphere of a legal waiter. They would bring them in the beer, the liquor, and the food. And then another thing in which the clientele would want procured for them is women. So that is something that the waiters would do. Hear what type of women that the clients would want, and then they would match them up. And this is where Jack would come in. He himself would become a pimp waiter. So it would be essentially to usher in appropriate women to the vicinity of waiting, paying men. Because of this, Jack states that all he did was bring two willing parties together, and he didn't see anything wrong with it. And initially, he said if you're bringing like two consenting parties together, what is the harm? And there is logic within that. If you're bringing two consenting adults together, yes, that does have validity to it. However, as you can see with his success as it continues to grow, and as we'll touch on later, he does brag about how many women he will begin to accrue and his means of accruing them. It's less innocent than he brings on. And this is all happening at his family's tavern. So this is where he's starting to dip his toes in the tavern. His like toes in the sand. So this is where he's starting to learn the trade. Now, this would all kind of come to a head in 1750 when Jack would ultimately start working at Shakespeare's Head's Tavern. At this point, he already had success at working at a waiter pimp, and he would be brought under the tutelage of a man named Packerton Tompkins, who taught him even more tricks. Because of the success that Shakespeare's Head had, it was a very popular location. It was a very popular tavern. There was clientele hunger, and the clientele there had growing needs. And along with Jack's drive to become one of the most successful pimps there, the need for new women was a constant thing, which meant that Jack had to look further and beyond the boundaries of Covent Garden. So he was no longer just looking in his neighborhood for girls. He was no longer just looking in Covent Garden. He was having to constantly go beyond that. And some of his favorite means of procuring women were as followed. So he said he loved going after servant and working class women, as he felt that the women were no strangers to sex, or they could easily be talked into going to the trade. And this, remember, if we go into 2 episodes ago, like I talked about with Judith Walkowitz, it kind of does tie into the notion that, you know, those in the working class, women in the working class, you know, they were no stranger to supplementing their income with prostitution. Another thing that I did find interesting is that Jack did like going unhappily married women, and the reason he gave for this is he said that he would tell them that there was financial independence to be had with prostitution, of that they can get out of their marriage with the money that they can make from it. And then on the darker side of things, and this is where we're going of this is no longer two consenting parties, is some of the members of his clientele would pick girls off the street. They would tell Jack to target them. And Jack at the time, and this was a known practice, essentially they would tell Jack which girl they wanted for the night. Jack would then take that girl by either a means of telling her, I have need of a maid, I have need of employment, I have a place of employment for you. Then getting them set up in a house. He would often have like houses that he would rent, put the girl in the house, lock her there, and then have his client go to the house. The client would rape her. And then in the morning, Jack would come back, explain the situation, and be like, you can go back to your work, or since you know you're already in this situation, you can now start being a prostitute for me, or you can now become so-and-so's kept woman and you'll be paid for it. And that was another means that he procured girls. And it wasn't just Jack who did that. That was a known practice that him and other pimps and other madams did at the time. I'm going to get into it next episode because I'm going to cover Charlotte Hayes, who was one of the most well-known prostitutes and madams during this period. She did that as well. But it was essentially hunts that the clients would send him on and that the clients wanted him to do. And so we can see with all these women that Jack is now starting to accrue, as well as with all the clients that Jack is starting to have with all of their needs. This is where the pimp list would come in. Jack was by no means the first pimp in the history to do this. He will be by no means the last to do this. And what essentially it is, it's a written list that details the list of his girls and where to find them. And then maybe it will give a description of them depending on the pimp's ability to write and ability to read. Then it will maybe give a description of the girl, their age, the sexual specialty, and then a price. For Harris, it was more. He took this very seriously. To be added to his list, his girls had to undergo an examination by a surgeon and have the surgeon sign off on it saying that they were in good health. Because what Harris valued overall is he wanted all of his girls under him to be of the best quality and of the best material. They then had to pay Harris 20 pounds, essentially saying if he ever found that if any of the information was wrong, that the girls would have to then pay him. He would also then give a description of the girl, where to find them, if she was a kept mistress, and if so, by who, and then what was the rate. So this is a description of what one of Jack's pimp list would have looked like. So, name, Fannie Murray. Condition, perfectly sound in wind and limb. Description, a fine brown girl, rising 19 years next season. A good side box piece, will show well in the flesh market, wear well, might put off for a virgin any time these 12 months. Never common this side of Temple Bar, but for 6 months. Fit for high keeping with a Jew merchant. M.B. a good premium from Ditto, then run of the house, and if she keeps out of the lock, may her fortune and ruin half the men in town. Place of abode, the first floor at Miss Blank, at Milliner's at Charing Cross. So essentially, it's just pretty this is Fannie Murray, and Fannie Murray was also a very well-known prostitute at the time. This is the girl, this is where you can find her, this is who is currently keeping her, the Jewish merchant. This is her price. This is how well I think she will do and how well I think she can keep for. And that is kind of the example of his list and numbers in it. And in 1758, that would be kind of the height of Harris's influence. He said in about 6 years, he had acquired a fortune of about 400 to 500 pounds from pimping alone. And his list was rumored to have about 400 names on it. So in that list, and it may have been kept in just a little pocketbook, they would have been about 400 other entries, just like the one I read. Now, if you read that, and if you heard that, you're like, that doesn't sound that interesting to read aloud. While it provides great information, it's nothing really that profound. It's nothing attention grabbing. Now, here is where Sam Derrick comes in. Sam Derrick was a draper, or essentially what is called a linen merchant. He comes into the picture. He would hear about this Pimp's List, and he would see such potential within it. We actually don't know much about Sam, just like we don't really know much about Jack. But we do know that he came from Ireland and he was born in 1724. And from a young age, Sam always knew that he was going to be a poet. However, his family had much different plans in mind for him. So his aunt and guardian had plans to make a linen merchant out of him and sent him on to become an apprentice to do so. For about 7 years at night during his apprenticeship, after his studies, he would write and study poetry, and he would save up all of these poems during his apprenticeship to hopefully one day accumulate and publish them. He somehow managed to complete his apprenticeship, which apparently surprised everyone. And he did all right as a linen merchant in the beginning. He had a practice over in Dublin, and it was said that in the beginning he was really good and able to split his time between Dublin and London for a bit. However, Sam, being the poet, being the artist soul that he is, when he was London, he found his way to the piazza. And that is where he discovered artists like him. And while in the beginning, he was kind of able to maintain this double life of going back and forth between London and Dublin, of, maintaining his successful, linen merchant life and able to save up money on that side of things. And then also, while in London, live that artist life. He was in a few plays. He was able to write a few forms of poetry. After a bit, in 1751, he decided he couldn't do it any longer, and he decided to move to London on a more permanent basis with the money that he had saved. The poetry did not grant him as much success as he thought he would, and he pretty much had to call in every favor that he had saved. And this was also because Sam had two very, very big vices. One was women, and the other was his love of very expensive clothes. I remember one part I read, it said that he would spend so much copious amounts of money on 6 embroidered jackets and then only have one clean undershirt under it. So the undershirt would be filthy, but he would have a really nice embroidered jacket over it, which, just for a little bit of pretext, that's the complete opposite of what you're supposed to do. Because your undershirt, you're supposed to have multiples of those, because those are the ones you take off and you wash constantly, because those are the ones that are constantly on your skin and are getting dirty. So you need multiples of those. Whereas your over jacket, your overshirt, the nice embroidered piece, you're lucky if you have one of those or two of those. Because like I said, those are really expensive. And those are the outers. They shouldn't really be touching your skin, so they shouldn't be getting that dirty. So you don't need a lot of those. Sam had 6, but no clean undershirt. It's just his priorities were just not there. But he did, during all this time, he was spending it at, Shakespeare's Head, at Bedford. And he was getting to know, all of the prostitutes that were there. He was gaining their favor. He was said to be, a very, at times, he was, a very lovable guy. Also, times, he just wasn't all there, and he kind of just put his passions before, practicality, which is also, not great at all. But because he was, building all of these relationships, and he was spending all of this time at Shakespeare's Head and at Bedford's coffee shop, he was able to become very observant to what was going on. And he also was kind of like aware of pieces that were becoming published and were gaining popularity. Lewd literature was kind of having its heyday during this time. And so with that in mind, and with what he knew what was going on, he was like, I know about all this really cool stuff and all of these interesting characters and all these interesting people and the everyday going on of, you know, these coffee shops and these taverns. He's like, what if I actually just write about it? And so that's kind of like what he did. He wrote about the daily life and characters of the taverns and the coffee shop. So the first one that he wrote was the memoir of Shakespeare's Head. And with the success of that, he then published the memoirs of Bedford Coffee Shop. And they did have some success. They did hit it off. And with that, it kind of like revealed a life and revealed to the people and kind of garnered some interest. And what stuck out to people was kind of like Jack Harris's actions and how he was like procuring girls and kind of like what the life of a pimp was. Honestly, now that I'm saying this out loud, this was kind of their version of Vanderpump Rules. It really was their version of Vanderpump Rules. Because not everyone has like access to all of this. But the people who do knew the names, knew the innuendos, and they knew all what was going on, and they were there for it. And so kind of like this garnered attention and helped kind of put a name to him. And what this also did, it put him in close vicinity with Jack Harris. And with that, he was able to kind of like observe Jack Harris's life, kind of like what I've said, what the daily ins and out look like. And it also got him in the know of the pimp list. And Derrick knew that the pimp list was a gold mine. And he also knew it was a space that he could flex his poetic ability as well. He knew the book would appeal to the same audience members of the tavern and the coffee house memoir. He knew that the market was there. Like I said, he knew there was a market for raunchy, lewd works as well. And he also wanted it to kind of serve and be a practical guide. Like, kind of like a how-to guide, where to go. Like, the modern, like, their version of, like, a Yelp. Of, like, where to find the best practices and, like, where to find the best women and where to find, like, you know, like, your own interest and where to get them. Now, when it comes to the deal made between the two men, not much is known. We do know that Jack Harris gave over the rights to use his name. That's pretty much it. We know that Harris probably most likely received it all in like a one-time payment. The reasoning for that is like no one could have predicted it would have been a 38-year print run. And the second reason is because the authorship of the list and the printing and publishing of the list itself of the book changed so many times. That's why a lot of historians believe that, and kind of like why I believe too, and just kind of how Harris reacted towards Derrick, that it was just like kind of like a lump one-time payment. Now, regarding the publication itself, so during like the first editions of it, several key factors. From the 1760s to the 1780s, every edition started with a sermon praising the merits of prostitution. That was one thing that you could always count on, and that was always written by Derrick, and then until he died, and then even after he died, they just kind of like copied and pasted it. Because Derrick believed that the prostitute was a woman who was wrongfully prosecuted by society and who's wrongfully shunned by society when she shouldn't have been. And the reason he believed that is it was actually the prostitute we should thank for keeping the peace, because it was her who placates the violent natures of men. And if we didn't have the prostitute, Derrick argues, men would be running and causing chaos and violence around London and around town. So that is why he praised the prostitutes so much. And also in part why he wanted to kind of give this book to them as well, as a way to quote unquote honor them. Honor being used very loosely. Now, in terms of how did Derrick get the names of the prostitutes, he may have gotten a few from Jack Harris's list, but we do know for the most part, a lot of them came, specifically in the first versions, from women that Derrick personally knew, that they were most popular on the town, or they were women that his friends knew. And then what's kind of really interesting as well is this making it like a whole kind of like TMZ, as well as he would ask members of London to be his eyes and ears. He said, quote, "Send us the anecdotes of their private engagements and places of abode," end quote. So he was like kind of asking like the members of London to like kind of tattle on themselves, tattle on others, and it just shows that like not much has like really changed with like gossip columns and everything. And I do love like that element of like, to quote Morbid, of like humans are gonna human, people are gonna people. Like this was written almost like 150 years ago, and it shows that just not much has changed. And anyways, so, and it also like does bring up the question of like how much did this kind of compete with the Pimp's list itself? And to answer that, it really didn't, because yes, did this provide you with like an overview of where to find them? Yes. This was published once a year. And while this did have to be maintained, it was still only a once a year occurrence. So it was always going to be outdated and behind the times. Whereas the Pimp, like, they daily had to be aware of what was going on and up to date. So it kind of, if anything, it was an adjacent, and it was just like an aid. And if anything, it kind of did help them and abate them in any way possible. Now, Harris's list would be in production until 1795, and it would generally follow the same format. The material itself, quality-wise, over the years, would have very little resemblance to Derrick's first work. So what Derrick intended when he first set out for this was his work would be for men who had some education and for men to understand his wit, aka men of a higher class and middle class standing. And he really wanted it to serve as a guide to like London's underworld. Once Samuel died in 1769, little can be found about the list following authors, and then the list would start taking on a life of its own. Now it would become more of like a branded book, more so a little bit more gimmicky. It's less guidebook, and it's more about the stories. And you can see how authors started taking more so like a very much more literary approach. They did away with like the harsh truths that rang with Derrick's work, and they tried to make the prostitute into like Venus's and Grace's herself, with a lot more alliterations and references to Greek and like Roman mythology and art. In the 1780s, you see even more of a decline in the work. So the truth becomes even less pervasive. You start to find repeating stories from years prior. And so it's a lot more about archetypes than telling the truth. So it's very relevant that like in the 1780s, they're not really even trying anymore. They're not trying to stay up to date. They're just publishing the book because it's been around so long and it has that following and it has that following and that branding behind it. It's something they kind of feel like they have to publish just to keep up with it. 95 is the last year that the book would be published. And the long story of how that would become the last year is the book was taken on by new printers. Two brothers with the last name Roach and a man named Atkins. Now, due to a new ruling made by King George III, he was really trying to cut down on the publication of lewd materials. They were told to no longer print the book. One of the Roach brothers did anyway, and he got arrested. During his trial, he said he didn't know. He was not believed, and he was sentenced to a year in Newgate prison, and that was not it. He still had to pay a £100 fine on top of that. And so it really just showed like how much society had changed in the course of 35 years since its original publishing, when this book was at its heyday and everyone was crowding around it and wanting a copy, versus now where it was trying to be silenced, and that was no longer an appropriate subject matter for London society. So even though the publication of Harris's List ran from 57 through 95, we only have volumes from 9 years. So from those 9 years are the only ones that have evaded like wear and tear and the censorship of the time. And from that, over 1,000 names and short biographies of women have been active in the trade of prostitution are recorded for posterity. With that being said, I will read a few of the ones that I found interesting. Let's see, which one do I want to read? Bette Davis, alias Little Infamy, Russell Street. Of all the ladies we have inserted in our lists, Bette is the most eminent among those of her own class, who have given her the name Little Infamy from her abandoned and libidinous disposition. It is reported she has transplanted an antique gonorrhea by many drunken vicious husbands to their innocent wives, into the blood of posterity, and that many sessions of paper have owed part of its historical existence to heroes of her creating. Let this be as it Morris Inamorosos to be careful. A word to the wise is enough. 61. Miss Coyer, Craven Street, The Strand. To trace this lady through all mazes and wanderings, from her first setting out in life to the time of her appearance on the stage in the character of Miranda, would far exceed the boundary of our limits. We must therefore content ourselves with giving a brief outline of her character, which we have opportunities of being well acquainted with. She was brought up under a wing of the celebrated birds of paradise, who taught her the rudiments of knowledge, from which she soon, by the strength of her natural genius, became a complete mistress of the science, in which she has cut a conspicuous figure. She is about 28, is slim and tall, has fair complexion, brown hair, good teeth, and is upon a whole very pretty woman. She lately behaves with a great deal in reserve in public, but in private, when she likes her company, she is not more agreeable, good-natured, convivial soul in the universe. 1779. Kitty Beckley, Poland Street. This lady has been at the service of every man that has a mind her from 13th year. Her mamma was a midwife in Ireland, from which country Miss Beckley came. No woman was ever more hackneyed from the lord to the porter. Every sect, every country has tasted her sweet body. She is really an elegant figure and a charming sweetness in her countenance, but she is wicked as the devil and extravagant as Cleopatra. She is generally 3 times a year in the bailiff's hands, but still makes a figure. She is now descending into the vale of years, being at least 35, and is reported to have ruined 20 keepers. 1761. Polly Jackson, late above place, Rathbone Place, number 22. Polly is a little fluttering child, about 14 years of age, has full dark eyes and a projecting mouth with tolerable good teeth, but upon nothing striking or extraordinary. If her youth has not been fledged, our recommendations, she is certainly possessed of them. She was debauched about 10 months ago by the noted Captain Jones, who was convicted of unnatural crimes. She has passed for maidenhood since that period of 20 times, and if paid accordingly, and being under direction of a very good lady, who directs her to play her part to admiration. She is in a very good way of getting money. 1773. It's a child. Okay. This one just makes me laugh. Pole Forster, Bow Street. They're very opposite of her namesake, being disagreeable, ugly, and ill-behaved. She has an entrance to the place of pleasure as wide as a church door, and breath worse than a Welsh bagpipe. She drinks like a fish, eats like a horse, and swears like a trooper. An errant drab. 1861, I'm sorry. Breath worse than a Welsh bagpipe. I will give Mr. Derrick that. That is a good insult. Now I'm gonna read some from the 1780s. 1788 to kind of show just like how much it shifted. This is a long one, but I think it like perfectly encapsulates like just how flowery the language got. So this is Miss Luster, if I had to guess. Number 6, Union Street, Oxford Rose. It starts with a very long poem that I'm not going to read, mainly because the poem is very dirty, and this is not that kind of podcast. I'm not going to read it. If you want to see this book, it's called Harris's List of Covent Garden Ladies. It's available on Amazon. It's the first one. Such all-pleasing luster leads the train, and smile like the morn unfolds her heaven of beauties. Oh, for Gildo's touch o'er Tom's thoughts, to paint the richness of unequal charms, every perfection that can possibly adorn the face and mind of woman seems centered in this bewitching girl. Hither resort, then, ye genius lovers of beauty and good sense, here whilst Plutus reigns, may you reveal nor know Saveti. Here feast the longing's appetite, and return with fresh vigor to every attack. Now arrive at the tempting age of 19. Her imagination is filled with every lustrous idea. Refined sensibility and fierce desire can unite. Her form is majestic, tall, elegant, her make truly gentle, her complexion as April's lily fair, and bloom as June's brightest rose. Painted by the masterly hand of nature, shaded by the tresses of the darkest brown, enlivened by 2 stars that swim in all the essence of unsatiated love, her pouting lips distilled nectarous, take 2. Take 3. Her pouting lips distill a nectarous balm, and through the flames its thrilling transports start, which when parted display a casket of snow-white pearls, range the nicest regularity the neighboring hills below full, ripe for manual pressure, firm and elastic, and heave at every touch. Dear fucking Lord. The asylum front in the center of a black bewitching grove, supported by 2 pyramids white as alabaster, very delicate and soft as to... Oh god, that's what... Okay, we're gonna skip that. At the approach of their... He does call a guy's part his favorite member. Oh, no, his favorite lord. And for 3 guineas... Oh god. Hold on, I am going to read this part. Their favorite lord of Doobadoop. And for 3 guineas, he is conducted to this harbor of never-failing delight. And to all this she sings well, and is a very cheerful companion. And she's only been in life 9 months. Yeah, that's the only one I'm going to read, because I didn't even think I was going to read the full thing, because, yeah, so that is just a little taste of how wild they get. I just read some more, and I'm like, I can't believe, they do that. Yeah, so that's just kind of like how wild and ludicrous and verbaceous they get towards, like, the 1780s and 90s. Because this whole book that I'm reading here is from 1788. So you can just see how we're slipping into the verbaciousness from when Derrick was coming in calling. Let's see. Yeah. There was a huge difference. Okay, I kind of want to read this other one, but like it's like so many innuendos, but like it's this one, it's talking about, no, my mom listens to this. So, like, Mom, if you're listening to this, I'm sorry, but this next one, it talks about a prostitute who's skilled at the art of giving head, and her name is Miss Noble. It is from 1788 as well, so it is from this one. God, she is the most communicate skill in reviving the dead, for she lives nothing but active life. She is happy when she can restore it. Her tongue has double charm, both when speaking and when silent. For the tip of it, properly applied, can talk eloquently to the heart. Okay, yeah, I'm gonna end there. But yeah, so like that's just like you can just really tell when ownership changed. Because we go back to like Katie Beckley, the one I read earlier, and how Derrick described her as like she's an elegant figure with a charming sweetness, but she's wicked as the devil and is charming and is extravagant as Cleopatra. Like, that's way different verbiage than the others I read. Yep. Reuben Holt at the end, and I think she encompasses this very well. She said that Harris's list provided men with the means of gratifying their lust and enjoying themselves. And I think that perfectly encapsulates just how Derrick, when he created this list, he said his goal was to put the prostitute in a better light. He said he was a woman who was wrongfully prosecuted and shunned by society. And she was. But what this book allowed is therefore another means for men to gawk at them. To find them, like Reuben Holt said, gratify their lust. The prostitute is not put back in her own story. And yes, while some of them did pay Derrick and did pay Harris to be put into the list and to be painted in a good light, it was a means to make business. So I just think it's like a very interesting concept all in itself. And it has to go with another thing of, while these women were not the authors of their own stories by any means, I think it does allow us as historians, as people looking at the past, it does give us a glimpse and a means to read between the lines, read between the archives to see what is there and what isn't there, and to hopefully like one day peel back the curtain. Because the list does give us a glimpse of pointing out where these women were at one place at one time. It gives us physical descriptions of them, and it gives us a name, which may not have been their real name, but it's a start. It's a starting point, which we can use to work backwards. And I'm going to touch on it a little bit more in the next episode when I go over Charlotte Hayes, of just exactly kind of like who these women were, where did they come from, what parts of society were they, because they really, these women in particular, they did come from all parts. But hopefully, and then maybe some year in the future, if I have more time and given more resources, it's something that maybe more of us can pursue and put more into it, to dive deeper onto these women and give something back to them. And with that, thank you for tuning into this episode, listening in, hearing those interesting stories. Thank you for everything. If you like the episode, like, share, subscribe, please rate it. You know, do anything possible. I love doing this, so anything I can do or you can do to just help make it more possible, I will greatly appreciate it. I will talk with you guys next week, and we will talk more about the prostitute and Madam Charlotte Hayes, and we'll hear how she actually ties into Harris's list and hear more about how she affected the town of Linden. Have a good one.